which is the provincial government policy on how to protect and recover the species that came out in December of last year, and the grassland stewardship piece of that in particular. But before I get there, I'm going to provide a whole bunch of background. Some of this will be very familiar to many of you, and some of it we've heard a little bit today, so I'll try to go through that quickly. I am going to talk about the Endangered Species Act, the 2 species of birds in the province, some of the timelines around the policy and regulation development, and so the policy being the GRS and the regulation being the exemption regulation for agricultural operations. Then I'll speak to the GRS and, as I said, the Grassland Stewardship Initiative, that's one of the key policy commitments within that, and then talk about some next steps. So, a lot of species at risk in Ontario, more than 200 species, many in southwestern Ontario, southern Ontario, and so a little bit on the Endangered Species Act. I guess the first thing to identify is that the Act established an independent body of scientific experts, CSIRO, that assess and classify species at risk. And those species that are endangered or threatened automatically receive habitat protection, and they are also automatically protected under the Act. Once a species is listed and is protected, threatened and endangered species are required to have recovery strategies developed, which provide independent advice to government and also government response statements. So the government is legislated to develop these products that outline how the species will be protected. As well, there's a bunch of tools, I think, that may have been alluded to around agreements and permits and regulations that are also identified under the Act and are intended to provide balance of species protection with human activities. And then the Act really identifies and supports stewardship by landowners and organizations. So that's an important part of how species at risk are protected in Ontario. So a little bit more information on the recovery strategies and the government response statements. As I said, the recovery strategy is a legislated requirement under the Act for endangered and threatened species, and it is for each species upon listing, a recovery strategy is commissioned. It is a technical, science-based document. It provides independent advice and recommendations on how to protect and recover endangered and threatened species. So it is expert advice to government, and it's based on the best available scientific knowledge as well as Aboriginal traditional knowledge and community knowledge. Once a recovery strategy is prepared, then again, there is a requirement for government to prepare a response statement, which is the government policy identifying how Ontario intends to recover and protect the species. So it does outline what the recovery goal is and also a number of intended actions. So as I said, it's based on the recovery strategy advice, but also on other input from the public, from stakeholders, Indigenous communities, information from other jurisdictions, and finally, it considers potential socioeconomic effects. The GRS will identify what actions are feasible for the government to lead directly and what actions the government will support. And it does some priority setting. So that's what the sort of policy cycle looks like. So I'll just give some of the background now on bobolink and eastern meadowlark in Ontario, and as we all know, they are both threatened species. So we've heard that they've been experiencing significant population declines, as have other grassland species. And because they are listed as threatened species, they do receive species and habitat protection. The listing of these species largely is due or was due to the high rates of decline that they have experienced. They're widespread across Ontario's agricultural regions, as we've heard, nesting in pastures and fallow fields and hayfields, and really they have benefited from the land clearing for agriculture that was associated with European settlement. The breeding period we know coincides with hay harvest and cattle pasturing, so there's incidental mortality associated with those activities, and they've also experienced loss of habitat linked to changes in land use, agricultural practices, and we've heard about their linkages to cattle and pasture. So when these two species were listed, there was really strong interest and concern from the farming community and interest in trying to understand how farmers could avoid contravention of the species and habitat protection provisions of the ESA and still be able to farm. So we've seen this already today, but really just trying to illustrate that the occurrences of these species really overlap quite heavily and reflect the relationship with agricultural landscapes in Ontario. And so some of the timelines, the species were listed, and quite early on to address that concern around the interactions of the species and agricultural landscapes, government provided an exemption from the ESA requirements for agricultural operations. So really to allow farmers to continue to carry out agricultural practices or agricultural activities. The exemption was specific to bobolink and eastern meadowlark and was intended to provide government with the time to develop a practical approach to the protection and recovery of the species while allowing agricultural activities to continue. So shortly after, MNRF and OMAFRA also established the Bobolink and Eastern Meadowlark Roundtable, which was a multi-stakeholder advisory committee. It included representatives from the agricultural community, conservation groups, municipalities, First Nations, development community. And the mandate of this group was to provide advice and recommendations to help protect and recover these species and their habitats, and recognizing that agricultural operations could continue. So a pretty strong and effective group that really was able to pull together multiple perspectives and develop some practical and thoughtful recommendations. The recovery strategy was developed or completed in May of 2013, and then shortly after that, the roundtable recommendations were released. So these were two pretty substantive documents that were really helpful in moving forward and developing the government policy. The roundtable recommendations really came out as an integrated solution package that talked about stewardship incentives, talked about research and monitoring, education and outreach, and also at the same time recommended a continuation of the exemption, so extending that for another 10 years. So as I said, the GRS, a policy proposal was posted in September. That was posted alongside, so as a package with a regulatory proposal that did respond to the recommendations, so and was to extend that exemption for another 10 years. So that those documents, or the policy document, was then finalized in December. So now we have the GRS, which is the government policy, and the Grassland Stewardship Initiative is the key policy commitment really within that. And aligned with that, we have a continuing exemption regulation, so some regulatory certainty there. I will say also that's a bit of a unique approach, putting those two pieces together, but I think it really made sense for these species and in these circumstances. So I'll speak a little bit now to the actual government response statement. And you've heard a little bit about this already. So there is a short-term and a long-term recovery goal. And in the short term, we're looking to slow population declines by enhancing and improving and maintaining grassland habitat. Over the longer term, we are seeking to stabilize population levels for both species at 65 and 72% of their current population sizes. So recognizing that some decline will continue as the actions of the GRS and actions across Ontario are enabled. Ultimately, though, trying to sustain these population sizes and stabilize them throughout the current range in Ontario. There's really three focus areas around the different types of actions. There's actions addressing stewardship and awareness, habitat protection and management, and research and monitoring. And so I've mentioned the Grassland Stewardship Initiative, which really is the key feature from a stewardship perspective and really for this GRS. It provides a framework for a centralized and strategic stewardship, trying to coordinate stewardship provincially in order to promote and incent protection and maintenance and management of grassland habitat. The target is 30,000 hectares of high quality grassland habitat managed for these species. There's a number of other high priority actions that are identified in the GRS. I'm not going to go into them in a whole lot of detail, but just to say that there's actions around developing, implementing and evaluating safe harbor instruments, looking at the development and implementation of grassland habitat tools and guidance, and monitoring and reporting on the GRS and regulation implementation effects both on species and on habitats. So there's a commitment there to monitoring and reporting. Few more details around the Grassland Stewardship Initiative. So it really is intended to recognize and acknowledge that stewardship and leadership by Ontario landowners and organizations really is essential to supporting and recovering these species. And we've heard about how tightly these grassland birds are linked to agricultural landscapes in Ontario. So the GRS makes this commitment that I've already described and then goes on to outline in a little more detail what a grassland stewardship initiative looks like. It will promote, support, and deliver grassland stewardship. The policy framework, the mandate, the priorities will be established, and government will also support its implementation, so commitments to funding to do that. On-the-ground actions are intended to be administered by a third party, acting at arm's length from government, and it's a voluntary stewardship approach. Looking to promote opportunities for all interested landowners and organizations, conservation groups, institutional and industry sectors, and also to support the development of grassland knowledge resources and habitat management tools. So I just described the government roles around policy, setting policy and priorities and providing funding. Partner roles will include coordinating and establishing agreements with landowners and land stewards, developing and delivering an incentive program, and monitoring outcomes, again, both for habitat and for the species. We'll need to identify target lands, so looking at really a range of types of pasture lands, hay fields, old fields, and remnant and restored native grasslands. So over the next 20 years, we will aim to have 30,000 hectares of grasslands enrolled in the program. We are trying to front end that and attain about 75% of that target within the first 10 years, really recognizing that there will be a delayed effect on species and grassland establishment. And then there will be incentives linked to long-term management and protection of grasslands. So that's how it is, this Grassland Stewardship Initiative is scoped within the GRS. Just quickly, I think we've all heard these. There's other benefits of grassland stewardships to multiple species at risk, to pollinators. Supporting grasslands can also support our provincial climate change objectives through carbon offsetting, carbon sequestration. And there are a range of other ecosystem benefits, including soil quality and water quality. And also the Grassland Stewardship Initiative, again, does recognize that tight link and role for farmers and landowners in providing habitat for these species. So now that we have the policy developed, we're looking at next steps for the design and implementation of this Grassland Stewardship Initiative. So really the first thing is to identify program design and consideration options. So what the delivery mechanisms will be, what partners will be involved, timelines. We will be putting out a request for consulting services to obtain advice on this. So that's something that you'll see, I think, very shortly. So landing really the design piece, scoping it out a little bit more. We'll need to establish scope and strategic targets, and we've heard a little bit about this in some of the earlier talks and thinking around how to set priority locations for implementation. So thinking about conservation, socioeconomic factors, effective patch size, habitat types, and then we'll also be identifying a delivery partner. So figuring out the design piece and then the delivery implementation. That will also be done through a competitive process and looking to select a partner or partners with the capacity to target and work with farmers, of course, as well as non-farm rural landowners and hobby farmers, conservation organizations, institutional and industry sectors. So really trying to be pretty inclusive in obtaining participation in the program. And then ultimately looking to implement the GSI across rural and agricultural communities throughout the range of these two species in Ontario. So thank you very much. If I have some time for questions.